For most of modern history, China was not rich. It was poor, unstable, and far behind the Western world. In fact, in the 1970s, China's economy was smaller than some countries in Africa and Latin America. And yet today, China is one of the most powerful economies in the world. So the question is not just how did China become rich? The question is actually how did China go from one of the poorest countries on earth to a global superpower in just a few decades? And that answer is more surprising than most people think. To understand China's rise, we need first to understand where it came from. After 1949, China became a communist state under Mao Zedong. The goal was simple. Simple in theory. Create equality and remove poverty. But in practice, the economy struggled. Private businesses were heavily restricted. Agriculture was collectivized. And economic decisions were made by the state, not the markets. Then came one of the most devastating periods in modern history, the Great Leap Forward. Millions suffered, and economic productivity collapsed. By the 1970s, China was still largely rural, poor, and isolated from the global economy. At this point, China was not seen as a future superpower. It was seen as a developing country trying to survive. Everything changed in 1978. The turning point. A new leader emerged, Deng Xiaoping, and with him came a completely different strategy. Instead of strict central planning, China began to experiment with something unusual, a mix of communism and capitalism. This was not an overnight revolution, it was a gradual shift. Farmers were allowed to sell surplus crops, special economic zones were created along the coast, foreign companies were invited to invest and build factories. China was essentially doing something radical. It was opening itself to the world without giving up political control. This combination became the foundation of China's economic transformation. China's path was not the only possible path out of communism. After the fall of the Soviet Union, Russia faced a similar challenge. How do you transition from a planned economy to a market economy? But the approach was completely different. In Russia, the transition happened extremely quickly. State-owned companies were privatized almost overnight. Prices were suddenly freed. Markets were opened in a very short time period. This strategy is often called shock therapy, and it was influenced by Western economic advisors and institutions who believed rapid liberalization would stabilize the economy faster. But the result was chaotic. Many industries collapsed. Wealth became concentrated very quickly, and living standards, they fell sharply in the short term. China took a different path. Instead of changing everything at once, China did something more gradual. It kept political control but slowly introduced market mechanism step by step. First in agriculture, secondly in coastal cities, thirdly in special economic zones, and only later on a national scale. In other words, Russia tried to transform the economy overnight. China changed it region by region over decades. This difference in timing and structure became one of the most important reasons why their economic outcomes diverged so dramatically. Once China opened up, something powerful happened. Labor was cheap, the workforce was massive, and infrastructure began expanding rapidly. Foreign companies realized something important. China was the perfect place to manufacture goods at scale. Factories moved in, production increased, exports exploded. From toys and clothes to electronics and machinery, China didn't just grow its economy, it became a factory of the world. And with exports came something even more important: capital, technology, and knowledge transfer. Once growth started, it reinforced itself. More factories meant more jobs. More jobs meant rising incomes. Rising incomes meant more domestic consumption. And more consumption meant even more growth. China entered a feedback loop of economic expansion. Cities like Shanghai and Shenzhen transformed from small industrial hubs into megacities. Skyscrapers replaced farmland. and millions moved from rural poverty into urban middle-class life. But China's rise wasn't just about economics, it was also about control. Unlike Western economies, China maintained strict political authority while allowing economic freedom. This created stability but also limitations, because while the economy opened, political power remained centralized. And that balance between control and capitalism is one of the defining features of modern China. So when we ask how did China become rich, the answer is not within one single decision. It was a series of reforms, timings, and the global opportunity. But above all, it was a transformation that few thought was possible. From isolation to integration, from poverty to power, and the story of China is still not finished.